Welcome. Today we are going to talk about the other two English empiricists other than Hume, who we've already addressed. We are going to talk about John Locke and George Berkeley. Broadly speaking, there are three main English empiricists. John Locke, 1632 to 1704, sometimes is called the father of empiricism. Others will also talk about him from the political standpoint and refer to him as the father of liberalism, classical liberalism being those ideas there. George Berkeley, 1685 to 1753, he's an immaterialist and also of Irish origin as well. So English in the broad understanding of it, especially in the 18th century. And David Hume, 1711 to 1776, who we've also addressed before, and is also of Scottish origin, so broadly constructed here as the English empiricists in these ideas. These three are often linked with their idea of substance. What has substance? What counts? Locke spoke very specifically. He had two substances. We have mind and we have matter. For Berkeley, it was really only the mind. And Hume pretty much gets rid of the mind as well and has no substances at all. Really no mind either. A little dig on him because I like it. From a brief casual observation, we will notice that there's a difference of where rationalism and empiricism find their footholds in their ideas. Rationalism is really the idea that's dominating the continent with people like Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz, while empiricism is found in the greater United Kingdom. British ideas are moving that. And in some ways, we kind of have a huge division once we cross that English channel on how we know and approach the world around us. The real dispute between rationalism and empiricism comes from the extent to which we are dependent upon our sense experience to gain knowledge, not just different names for different locations. Rationalists claim that there are significant ways in which our concepts and knowledge are gained independent of our sense experience. Right? Rationalists believe that we have some basis for our knowledge in our intuition and that we have some innate knowledge, that you hold some ideas in your mind and approach the world from a sort of starting point where you're going to observe and take things in, but it's interpreted through what you already know. And some of this is innate, just a part of you as being a rational creature. You have a rational nature according to the rationalists. Therefore, the name follows this idea. Empiricists, though, claim that sense experience is the ultimate source of all of our concepts and all of our knowledge. For the empiricists, Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, no source knowledge exists other than our sense experience. You know and understand the world only through what you observe, what you take in through your senses, and then you empirically think about it. It's just blank slate taking things in. The question is what can you know apart from experience? And if you only know things from experience, how do you really come to know them? How do they exist? Do they exist apart from your experiencing them? Little hint of Berkeley and his argument coming up here. And if you're not thinking of an object, does that object exist? And if so, why? Why would you claim that it does? Again, we'll get to Berkeley here in a little bit more with his argument. Right? Different empiricists will have different answers on what the nature of our experience is and how we will approach these ideas. So let's take a common example that we've talked about a number of times in this course. Let's talk about the tree. Where does your understanding of the tree come from? Does the idea of a tree exist apart from your particular experience of it? You've seen this tree before, and likely you'll see this one again and a few others. Does it exist only because you see it, because you're taking it in your senses? Where does your understanding of this tree come from? Does this exist apart from any of your experiences? Your seeing, your smelling, your touching, your tasting, etc. Does the word or name of tree add any additional meaning? Could I have called this object something other than a tree? Can I call anything a tree? Here's a nice cell phone tower disguised as a tree. Can we call it a tree? Makes it look a little prettier from far away, but is that really a tree? Is this a tree? Most of you would say no, that it's a cat. But why is it not a tree? Why is a cat not a tree? What if I call it a tree? What if it says that it's a tree, if I experience it as a tree? Or, if it actually says, hi, I'm a tree. More likely, I am Groot, but you know what I'm saying. Which of these things is a tree? Can they all be a tree if we identify them as such, if our senses take it in as such? Or is there an objective reality that exists apart from our experiences of these? If I experience a cell tower, a cat, or Groot as a tree, does that make them trees? Do any of these things change what they are if I decide it's a tree? Is there a fundamental truth of treeness that exists that's going to keep the cat or the cell phone tower or the fictional creature as a tree, any more than a digitally reconstructed tree being a tree? Is there some essential characteristic or idea or essence that is treeness? Is part of our whole question, and where does this come from? This is the challenge that empiricists need to answer in their debate with rationalists. The thing that Kant and other idealists believed that they answered, with the whole issue of phenomena, whether or not this is knowable. And remember, Kant really saw himself as trying to unite rationalism and empiricism, some of the truth that he identified within both. But where are we going to understand the nature of what is something? And what gives us the basis of that knowledge is really the heart of the debate between rationalism and empiricism. This is the heart of the debate that John Locke wanted to address. 1632 to 1704. He's primarily understood in his essay concerning human understanding, which he published in 1689. And this is where he's going to lay out his objection to the idea that there is internal knowledge in us, that we have any innate abilities or knowledge or understandings at all. And therefore, if we don't have any innate understanding, then there is no treeness. There's simply things we call trees. Correctly or incorrectly doesn't really matter, because it's how we experience them. It's how we identify it. It's what we do with this sense data. It's not objectively one thing or the other. Little background into Locke: he was born into a Calvinist family in England, which is somewhat surprising, as it would be rather strict in believing that there is a right and wrong to the nature of the universe, as Calvinists would. His father was a lawyer in Parliament and served during the English Civil War. So he has all of these additional sorts of layers of wanting to hold that there is an absolute understanding to things from his childhood and what he would have seen. How wars change and the law helps to construct things. And it's really from this reason that his political ideology will also develop and grow. From a quick starting point, looking at the broad arc of the essay concerning human understanding, we understand that his point was to examine the limits of human knowledge. All knowledge, he argues, is understood as coming from experience. This was in direct opposition to Descartes, who believed that there were fundamental truths innate in our human mind, which needed to be identified and understood by the active intellect. This will become, again, the hallmark between the difference of rationalism and empiricism, as we addressed earlier. In Book 1 of his essays concerning human understanding, he argues that there is no such thing as innate ideas in the mind or any evidence of universal truths known before our experience. In Book 2, he continues by addressing how all of our ideas can be explained as having their source in the ideas of sensation or ideas of reflection. So he's not saying there is no mind and it's just stimula, 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 but we also reflect upon what's been in our mind, and this is where ideas will also grow. Sensation are those ideas that have their origin in our senses, and ideas of reflection come from internal operations of our minds. We create complex ideas by constructing them from simple ideas that are presented to us. We look at two different things and we put them together, or 3 or 9 or whatever number. This is the answer to the question about how we can have ideas concerning things that we do not and cannot even experience. Ideas such as infinity. How can we have an idea about it and use it in math, physics, or anything else if we don't have an experience of it? Here he says that we have a negative idea about it, an idea drawing heavily upon the theologies of Dionysius and Maimonides, who we will address later. Of mental divisions, he says there are also further divisions on how ideas are stored in our mind. Matter, he argues, has two qualities: primary qualities such as size, shape, and solidity, and secondary qualities such as color, taste, and smell. So he says that we have objects that have a primary quality and a secondary quality, something that's essential in it and something that we're adding on to it. Now, this is going to be a difference between Locke and Berkeley. Berkeley doesn't like the idea of there being multiple qualities. So, for instance, following Locke, if we look at the apple, the primary qualities, size, density, and shape, are all evident and exist in this item itself, while the secondary qualities, color, is based on how you perceive it. And we can perceive the apple differently. By the way, this is the exact same apple as a moment ago, just different color saturation. How you perceived it is now different. Taste is also completely subjective. Do you like apples or not? Is this one too sweet, too tart? To your individual tastes. Is it fragrant? My senses dictate whether or not it is fragrant. Locke says this is not innate to the object. It's only fragrant because I'm picking up the smells of it, or I'm attuned to understand this. In Book 3 of Words, he treats the nature of language and meaning. Words, he argues, stand for ideas of whoever uses them. If not, they're only empty sounds. And as such, he's going to disagree with Plato considerably. In Book 4, he turns his attention to knowledge and opinion. He says our perception limits our idea of how something is. Our belief that something is one way excludes the idea that it can be otherwise. As such, we have no real limits on the possibilities of human knowledge. Kant argued against this, saying the only limit to our mind is the understanding and limits of our mind, and so there is a division here between him and Kant as well. Although, enough overlap, right? Your perception is going to limit how you see something. Are there 4 bars or 3? Really depends on where you start, where your eye gravitates to first, for instance, in this optical illusion. Is it innate in the object? No, it's not. It's an illusion. What you understand is that it is an illusion. This might be a limit in your mind, but you then construct it as one object or the other. Locke is also known for his contribution to Enlightenment political thought. This is the reason why he is often identified as the father of liberalism. He will influence Voltaire and other materialist understandings of nature. Growing up in a household that went through the English Civil War, which at least in a significant part was a division between radical Protestantism and moderate Anglican Protestantism, was over religion. He will write and advocate for toleration concerning religion. He also writes extensively on property rights and who owns their property and what rights do they have. He says, I have a right to the product of my own labor when I turn soil into farmland. And everyone has a right to their own person, to freedom from assault or other interference. But this also means that we voluntarily submit some of our property for protection of others. As long as it is just, there should be no rebellion. But when the leaders are unjust, they have a right to be overthrown, to ensure the right to your property. This is the argument here that he makes about property rights being essential natures of human rights as well. I have a right to my person and my property. My labor is my own, and the benefits of my labor should be my own. This, by the way, is one of the main arguments that's used later on to end notions of slavery, that you can't compel people to work for somebody else's benefit. If they're not getting anything from their labor, then that is robbing them of their human right and their dignity with this as well. And again, this has this basis in classic liberal Enlightenment political thought. Turning our attention now to the first 2 chapters of Locke's philosophical work concerning understanding, the essay concerning human understanding. He states that since it is the understanding that sets man above all other animals and enables him to use and dominate them, it is certainly worth our while to inquire into it. We need to look at what our human understanding is. This is what makes us us instead of any other animal, is our intellect. We're clearly not the strongest beast that exists. We're not the largest, we're not the smallest, we're not the fastest. But our gray matter does have a certain value to it, right? This separates us from other animals that exist. He says the understanding is like the eye in this respect. It makes us see and perceive all other things, but doesn't look in on itself. The eye helps us see the world around us, but it doesn't give us a lot of information about what the eye is. We need essentially a little introspection. And if you don't know what introspection is, you need to take a good long look at yourself. I know, that one was cheap and easy, but it was fun, right? Continuing on, he says, my purpose, therefore, is to inquire into the origin, certainty, and extent of human knowledge, and also into the grounds and degrees of belief, opinion, and assent. We need, he says, for my purpose, to consider that human ability to think. This is all that we need. This is where we're going to start. How is it that we come to understand the things that we believe? Notice here there's a very clear similarity to the beginning of Descartes in his work in the Meditations. The inquiry is into how we know what we know and if it is true or not. And this is the aim of what Locke is doing as well. Continuing on, Locke asks, so it'll be worth our while to find where the line falls between opinion and knowledge, and to learn more about the opinion side of the line. When we are concerned with something about which we have no certain knowledge, what rules or standards should guide how confident we allow ourselves to be that our opinions are right? Here is the method he tries to follow to answer this question. First, he asks, shall I inquire into the origin of these ideas or notions? Call them what you will, that a man observes and is conscious having in his mind. How does the understanding come to be equipped with them? Right? How do we use our understanding with the opinions around us? This is a challenge against rationalists such as Descartes, who believes that we have from the outset some innate propositions, and so he's really pushing back against this idea at the very beginning, just kind of casually throwing down that this is the starting point that you have, right? Secondly, I shall try to show what knowledge the understanding has by means of those ideas. How much of there is there? And how secure is it? How self-evident is it? Third, I shall inquire a little into the nature and the grounds of faith or opinion that is accepted of something as true when we don't know for certain that it is true. These are the steps he's going to go through. When we know what our muscular strength is, we shall have a better idea of what physical tasks we can attempt with hopes of our success. So he's going to be trying to figure out our mind like we might know with our body, right? Like Descartes, we first start with what we can know before advancing on to what is possible. And when we have thoroughly surveyed the powers of our minds and make some estimate as to what we can expect from them, we shan't be inclined either to sit still and not set our thoughts to work at all, in despair of knowing anything or to the questioning of everything, and to make no claim to any knowledge, because some things can't be understood. Some things, he's going to say, just can't be understood, but we can still make some claims to knowledge within all this. We're not going to just sit idly by. We're going to address how it is that we come to know things. Within our minds, we will understand some things are knowable and some things are not. Kant, for instance, argued once again that the one thing that the mind can't do is to know the limits of the mind. And Locke has got a sort of reason to feed this into Kant in his argument, right? This is not exactly what we're venturing to do with Locke. We're trying to actually understand where these limits are. Still, we are not to give into despair over the idea that some things are simply not knowable. Just because you might not be able to know something doesn't mean you should fall into despair. Some things are just what they are. In chapter 2, he moves on from just what might be understood as opinion versus what can actually be known. And he wants to start off with this idea of what speculative principles exist in the mind. Very clearly, he advocates that there are none. He says some people regard it as settled that there are, in the understanding, certain innate principles. People that we've talked about, Descartes and Leibniz and others. The idea that some of your knowledge is hardwired into us is also what Locke refers to as the innateness doctrine. These are conceived of as primary notions or first thoughts, letters imprinted on the mind of man, so to speak, with which the soul or the mind, depending on how you want to address this, receives from it when it comes into existence, and that it brings it with it into the world, right? This Platonic understanding of where ideas come from, and really kind of a leftover, as it were, from Neoplatonist ideas of us understanding things from the ultimate source of the one before we come to know it now. I could show any fair-minded reader that this is wrong, is what Locke says. If I could show, as I hope to do in the present work, how men can get all of the knowledge that they have and can arrive at its certainty with some things purely by using their natural faculties, your natural capacities and abilities, without any help from innate notions or principles. Right? The aim of this work is to show and to demonstrate that all of our knowledge comes from what we take in, that there is no hardwired programming. You may think of this like an old computer, right? Everything you know has to come from the outside. You're loading one disk, that is the operating system, into the machine, and then you're running the next disk, which is the actual program, and you're swapping things back and forth. And inherently, there's very little that the computer can do other than read the disks. This is where our mind comes in, right? We have sense data that comes in, and all our mind is able to do is take in this data. And then what we do with it is based upon other work, right? But it's still, you're putting in an old disk to run the operating system and an old one to run the program off of that. And this is the way things are. Everything that you know comes from the outside, according to Locke. And he argues that he should be able to show that everything we do know comes from the outside. Therefore, there is no need for an innateness doctrine. There is no need for some other source for our understanding. All of our information has to be put into the system. Right? This is where we are. Humans are no different, right? They read disks, we read our senses and execute the information that comes into it. Our senses are external data. Right? Everyone, he says, will agree, presumably, that it would be absurd to suppose that the ideas of colors are innate in a creature to whom God has given eyesight, which is a power to get those ideas through the eyes from external objects. It would be equally unreasonable to explain our knowledge of various truths in terms of innate imprinting, if it could just as easily be explained through our ordinary abilities to come to know things. Right? If we are able to understand things as they are, only through sense data coming in, then there's no reason to have an argument for innate knowledge. So I shall present the reasons that made me doubt the truth of the innateness doctrine. Right? This needs to go away, that this is what he's going to be presenting and giving us. It says, nothing is more commonly taken for granted than that certain principles, both speculative and practical, are accepted by all mankind. We already know things, like this is taken for granted, right? Some people have argued that because these principles are, or they think, universally accepted, they must have been stamped into the souls of men from the outset. If we already all agree with certain ideas, then where does that come from? Right? This is the challenge that empiricists have against rationalists. This argument, he says, comes from universal consent, and that it has a deficit in it. Even if it were in fact true that all mankind agreed in accepting certain truths, that wouldn't prove them to be innate, even if a universal agreement could be explained, since it could be explained in some other way, and he thinks he can present this as an object. He says, children and idiots have no thought, not an inkling of any of these principles. And that fact alone is enough to destroy the universal assent that any truth that was genuinely innate could have to have. If children and idiots, if imbeciles have no innate understanding of these big concepts that rationalists say are innate, then they're not innate, because everyone should then have them. Right? So if children and idiots have souls, minds, with those principles imprinted on them, they can't help perceiving them and assenting to them. Since they don't do that, it is evident that the principles are not innately impressed upon their minds, Locke argues. If they were naturally imprinted and thus innate, how could they be unknown? Right? The argument runs thus, right? If certain principles are universal innate, then everyone would know them. The definition of universal, right? Not everyone knows them, i.e. idiots. Thus, there are not certain principles which are universal and innate. You should be picking up here on the modus tollens argument, right? If A, then B, not B, therefore not A. This logical construction of the argument, this is what he's presenting here. Children may acquire them, and idiots do not, so it must be acquired rather than innate. If a child will learn these qualities, and an idiot still doesn't, then they're not really innate. They must be acquired. At least this is the argument as it goes. For a man may be capable of knowing, and indeed of knowing with certainty, many things that he doesn't in fact come to know at any time in his life. So if the mere ability to know is the natural impression philosophers are arguing for, all truths a man can ever come to know will have count as innate. Right? If people say, well, you're going to get to know them, therefore it's innate for you to know them, then really, is this what we would identify as innate? If what we're arguing for is potentiality, then what is actually innate? It's kind of reduced almost to just a word that's rubbish. And this great doctrine about innateness will come down to nothing more than a very improper way of speaking, and not something that disagrees with the views of those who deny innate principles. For nobody, I think, ever denied that the mind is capable of knowing many truths, right? This isn't the point. He's not saying you'll never know things. He says your mind is capable, but that doesn't mean that it's innate. Those who think that all knowledge is acquired rather than innate also think that the capacity for knowledge is innate. So this is the challenge that he has. Once again, some people have tried to secure a universal assent to the propositions they call maxims by saying that they are generally assented to as soon as they are proposed, and that the terms they are proposed in are understood. So here the idea is the argument now means that we know it when we hear it. What does that mean? Does that mean it's innate? If we hold that an idea is self-evident just because we hear it and we're like, yeah, I know what that is, but does that mean that you already knew it? Are we going back to Socrates and Meno, and all we're doing is now urging people to recollect something? And then we're very much holding on to the Socratic understanding of things. But is that what we mean by innate? And is this not simply just acquired? Isn't this how we would move and operate? It says that if we were to accept this as the argument, it will allow for it to be acquired, or more properly understood as nurtured. Right? This is what we're doing, is we're nurturing learning. In answer to this, I ask whether prompt assent given to a proposition upon first hearing it and understanding the terms really is a certain mark of an innate principle. If assent at first hearing and understanding the terms were the mark of innateness, we would have to accept as innate every proposition in which different ideas are denied one of another. We would have legions of innate propositions of this sort, not to mention all others. If what we're going to understand as innate is just, I come to accept it when I hear it, well, I might come to accept one thing as one way, and you might come to accept one thing as the other way, and they might be in direct opposition. Well, if that's the case, what's innate? Is it true or not? And then, of course, there is no idea of truth in any sort of objective manner. He continues, now I agree that a proposition is shown to be self-evident by its being promptly assented to by everyone who hears it and understands its terms. But self-evidence comes not from innateness, but from a different source which I shall present in due course. There are plenty of self-evident propositions that nobody would be so fanciful to claim to be innate. Right? Just because something is self-evident also doesn't mean that it's innate. Just because you would never make that claim, right? And I was saying if you're going to make it the argument that anything self-evident is innate, you've now overstepped this argument, let alone have conflicts that exist within them. Locke continues on in his work to give the examples of where we get self-evident principles from, and he continues to argue that we should never say that less general self-evident propositions should be accepted as the consequence of more general ones that we might take to be innate. Locke, as other empiricists that will follow him, argue against the idea that any knowledge is innate. Rather, it's all acquired. Experience is the ultimate source of our concepts of knowledge. Our understanding of the tree comes from our experiences of a tree. What we're able to say is a tree and isn't a tree is all derived from our experience of different trees, and then we assemble them together. Since nothing is innate, it follows that we must have the capacity to extend our minds beyond just the sense experience. There must be a rational capacity to this, and our mind is thus capable of extending our general experiences to combine ideas into complex ones. We can see early examples of what Hume saying that everything is in the mind. But for Locke, we will combine ideas such as horse and a horn and create a complex idea of a unicorn. There's no innate knowledge of a unicorn. None of us would be so bold as to say that they exist all around us. Right? It is a complex idea. We're taking ideas and we're compounding them together, even though we don't have any complex knowledge or any direct sense that this is the case, right? That we're just putting these things together. Our mind forms these complex ideas in this way.